Hi, this is Hilton Gieseneau introducing episode 4 of TheMossShow. There's been quite a long delay since the previous episode and this one. There's been quite a few things going on my side of the world. I've been finishing up quite a big project for a national retailer here based on the SharePoint platform. It's also been Dev Days for South Africa, where I presented on SharePoint as well as some ASP.NET stuff. But by far the most important news on my side has been the birth of my beautiful, amazing little baby daughter. Any of the mothers and fathers who listen to the show, I'm sure will understand the glowing pride on this side of the world. But the one advantage to the long delay has been that I've had a chance to get some great feedback from various corners of the globe for the show. One of the particular listeners that I'd like to call out is Robert McLean, who's got a great blog at www.sadev.coza with some fantastic SharePoint-related stuff, and he sent some really good feedback for the show. So, Robert, thanks for that, and look out for some of that feedback being incorporated into the show as well. If you've got any other feedback or you've got any suggestions for topics or anything like that, then please send them along. And I'll try and incorporate them where possible. One of the good suggestions that came through was to look at putting a tip together at the beginning of the show, so some sort of SharePoint tips and tricks. So I'm going to kick that off this episode and see how people enjoy that and what the feedback is around it. So the first tip I've got for this episode is something that I found on SharePointSearch.com just today, which was quite an interesting thing that I hadn't seen before, and it relates to iFilters. So if you listen to the search episode with Rory Hedden-Weeks, you'll recall at the end that he mentioned iFilters, which is a plugin for SharePoint that allows it to index specific file types when it's doing its crawling. So the Adobe PDF iFilter allows, for example, the search indexer to index the content in PDF files. But the tip on SharePointSearch.com mentions that the specifically Adobe PDF iFilter can only filter one file at a time, and of course this will slow the actual search indexing down. And he also has a comment that it has a high reject rate for new PDFs. So his recommended solution is to look at using another retail PDF filter, like from pdflib.com, or using the Foxit PDF iFilter. I use the Foxit PDF viewer myself, and I must say it works quite a bit faster than the standard Acrobat reader from Adobe. But that's enough pre-show banter. Without any further ado, let's jump into the episode itself. In this episode, I'll be interviewing Zlatan Dzinic, who has extensive experience around particularly taxonomy and records management in SharePoint. So let's hear what he has to say around records management.
I was proud and I was standing. I was lost in a crowd. But now this room is abandoned. Everybody keep on fading out. I was strong like a lion.
I'm sitting here today with Zlatan Dzinic, who's SharePoint MVP here in Cape Town, South Africa. Zlatan is a system architect and a technical lead on a variety of different SharePoint-related products. He's got a lot of ECM, Enterprise Content Management background, working with various versions of Microsoft SharePoint, 2003 and 2007, but he's also worked quite a bit with products like OpenText, LiveLink, Meridio, K2, and a couple of others as well. He's also got a lot of dev background in C# and products like Windows Communication Foundation and Windows Workflow Foundation as well. But Zlatan's primary focus definitely is SharePoint and architecting solutions around that product stack. So Zlatan's going to be talking to us today around some of the work he's done with records management, and we're going to be talking about some of the different things that make up a records management solution. So Zlatan, welcome. It's nice to have you with us, yeah?
Thank you, Hilton.
Maybe tell us a little bit about your background before we get into the actual episode as well. How did you come to be working with SharePoint particularly, and how did you come to this path, coming along from products like Meridio and OpenText? What makes you work with SharePoint as your platform of choice?
Okay, great. Well, started my career in information technology, basically based on working with e-commerce platforms and with content management platforms. And I was lucky enough to very quickly start working on enterprise content management systems. And at the time when I started working on it, which was many years ago, this was still a very new concept, and not too many people bought into it, and I became a huge fan of it.
Was that here in South Africa?
That was here in South Africa, funny enough. And those were the first initial projects that involved, like, the need would initially be, for example, to merely scan physical documents and have them retrieved via search or through a taxonomy structure, and so on. From there, we started building on and getting on more processes around these solutions that were being deployed and all that. So this is mainly how these tenders came about to be. Obviously, this came from mainly records management needs or records management business processes that already manually existed in various other organizations. And I mentioned that records management not just because it's a topic of this conversation, but mainly because that's what the primary objective was of these ECM systems that we were actually deploying at a time. So, like I said, I'm lucky enough from that, with respect to my background, that I can say that I worked with ECM systems my whole career, since what I call the official beginning of my career up until now.
Okay, so ECM, Enterprise Content Management, includes document management, document storage. So you've got a couple of documents in a store, let's call it a document library in SharePoint terminology. You've got some metadata around them, you maybe got a little bit of workflow, some approvals. So is that records management? What makes record management different from document management? Is it just another term? What's a record? Maybe let's also start there.
Document management is more about the life cycle of the document, of how, when the document gets created, as it goes through processes, how it gets edited. You have different versions of documents, the policies that surround it, and obviously how it eventually ceases to be and becomes deleted either or archived or whatever the case is. However, record is more specific to that, and that's in records management what we refer to as first, a document is what we call an active document, and that active document can or may not become a record. And then, what is the definition of a record? So, it's what is pertinent to your organization. It's more clearer to organizations like the public sector organization, like government, local, national, or provincial government. And for example, with them, everything is a record. Every little piece of information, we tend to joke, even the chewing gum paper, becomes a record. Whereas with private sector organizations, it's basically things that are sensitive to the business processes. And to basically to the way the organization operates, that are financially sensitive, that are legally sensitive. So things that can be used in case of litigation, and things that can be
or legislation, I guess.
Or legislation, yes, of course. So basically, record is a process, or basically a transaction that has happened within the processes of that organization, that then by becoming a record becomes official. So it becomes basically cast in stone, and as such can be then archived, or it can be deleted or destroyed, or if you're gonna archive it, you're gonna archive it for later. If you're gonna archive it, you're going to use it for later for purposes of litigation, like I mentioned earlier, or for restarting certain processes, and as a proof that such transactions have taken place.
So an active document, what you referred to earlier, would be something that exists in a regular document library where people are actively, excuse the pun there, but they're actively working on it and interacting with the document in terms of not just reading, but updating and creating new versions of the same document. And at the end of that document's active life cycle, it would then be put into a records management solution.
That's right, exactly. So basically, active document is while the life cycle of the document management side of that document is happening. So basically, upon the creation of the document, and then while the teams are mutually trying to work on it, so checking ins and outs and different versions until the publication of the major version, or an important minor version of that particular document. At the point in time when that document becomes an official transaction that should be recorded for later purposes within the business, and something that should reflect that business has done, okay, and that can be for any purpose. That should then become a record, and as such should either be then stored in a records repository or in a designated place within the taxonomy created within SharePoint.
Okay, so it's not a case of just like in Windows Explorer right-clicking and making it read-only. You would actually take that file somewhere else. You would put it into a specifically designated area.
Yes.
Would it be a move, or would that document still exist in its previous location?
It can be either. Okay. In the case of SharePoint, okay, and this is probably where our focus is going to be today. And this is a separate repository which is called the Record Center that is then created, and then basically from proper web content management repositories or team sites that are created within SharePoint, you would have a mechanism on an item level, meaning on a document level, to declare this document a record and have it sent on to the Record Center where it actually becomes a record.
So what's the interaction like? What would my experience as a user in a document library be if this record center is now configured?
Once it's declared a record, but the documents, that remains the active document in a library where the user has worked with it. However, once it gets sent and gets declared a record, that copy of a document becomes a record. It is maintained then in the records management, rather in the record center that is designated, and it's being maintained primarily by a records manager or records managers. And this is mostly obviously for security purposes and for easily enforcing appropriate policies that will then help, with proper records management.
So Zlatan, tell me, what has driven the need for all of this focus now on records management? There's a lot of publicity around it and a lot of marketing around it from Microsoft, particularly around the DoD spec and some of the work they've done there. Can you give us some of that background in terms of market drivers and also within SharePoint?
Okay, so basically there's always been a need for appropriate records management on the government side, because government is basically being held accountable for, and basically public sector in general. They've been held accountable for just about everything that they do. Also, they hold some of the things, like your deeds office will hold deeds that have been there since centuries ago.
Have they been holding them in SharePoint all of this?
No, unfortunately not. SharePoint hasn't been around for that long. Almost. However, they've always had a huge need for creating appropriate policies around the retention periods for these records, which is one of the major aspects of records management, and obviously, their disposal schedule when they should be destroyed as well. And on the other hand, you had other more stricter organizations like Department of Defense and so on and so forth. So basically, what has driven it now and brought it more into the space of large corporates and the private sector is the fact that there has been a lot of scandals, such as the Enron scandal and all that have shown that these large enterprises managed, because of very poor records management, they managed to, and very poor policies, they managed to hide these enormous frauds that have been happening. So things that have plagued the government before and other legal entities that have used records management, stringently, such as lost file syndrome, and obviously fraud and duplication and the whole thing, have now become an everyday problem for the large corporates. hence they've realized, listen, we cannot afford. These things have not only destroyed these large corporates and these large oil companies and large accounting companies, they have in fact created a significant dents in US and in world economy. So, the importance for that has grown to become paramount in these times, rather than an optional thing, that the companies would normally use. So, what happened is that you've had the National Archives and Records Administration Agency. They needed a proper policy standard for governing records management, and they've endorsed the Department of Defense's famous 5015.2 standard. As such, many governments around the world have adopted it as an official standard for their own records management, including our own. South Africa has adopted DoD, and hence why most of the solutions that have records management capability need to adhere to this standard in order for them to offer a proper records management capability, or in fact accepted records management capability in case of legislation, litigation, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so tell me, this DoD specification was created by the US Department of Defense, as you say, but it's being adopted worldwide as a standard for a lot of governments and a lot of organizations. But it also has a lot of stringencies. Does a company have to choose DoD records management or not at all?
Well, many governments and also basically many companies, many legislations have adopted multiple standards, not just DoD. Okay, there's the UK National Archives have released 2 operational standards for records management, which are also being adopted, for example, by our government. And you have I'm trying to remember the European Commission has created one. It was called MODRAC or MORAC rather, which was Model Requirement for Records Management and Document Management Policy. Sorry, it just took me a little bit to remember. And recently they have released MORAC 2 last year in 2008 in January. Okay, as an update. Many countries subscribe to that standard as well. Okay, not to say that there's a significant difference between all of these standards. The standards are, they just get a bit more stringent in the way they actually deal with certain things. Obviously, as long as what you need to do as a company or as an individual or basically as an entity, you need to look at the legislation. You need to see what the government subscribes to, so that you can see from a legal records management obviously perspective on what standards you should adopt or you should look at within your solution when you're creating a records management solution for yourself.
Okay, well, I think we're still talking conceptually, and we'll get to SharePoint and its implementation in a short while. And when we do that, let's talk about the actual DoD add-on pack as well and see what the implications of that are. Maybe tell me, in terms of records though, we've been talking about an electronic record, a document that you have that's an active document living in your document storage or document management system. What would one do with, a paper-based record, an actual invoice you've received, or a supplier record, something like that? Would that be dealt with also in some way in a records management? How would you incorporate the two together?
Okay, so basically the different kinds of record management that you can have electronic records management, and this is what we talked about. The governing principles are behind it, and what we mentioned with the DoD certification and with the MORAC and the whole thing. Basically, what you have on the other hand is the physical objects management. And physical objects records management, that's also governed. You can see in the US they've created a Sarbanes-Oxley Act that actually tells you about general records management and mostly focuses as well on the physical objects management itself. On the system side, it can still be governed by a records management solution that supports physical object management. And what is important here is that for the transactions about that in the regard of this object to be recorded and to be put as a record. So this is, the actual physical representation of the object exists in the system, but or rather electronic representation of the physical object. However, who has the ownership of the object, who has performed what with the object, and where does the object end up with, and the rules around managing that object exist within the system. And obviously they're conditioned, if you want to go further, they're conditioned by, what happens on the system itself, which process is initiated, who has checked it out, who hasn't checked it out, who is allowed to have it in a certain position. The easiest way to actually explain it, as well as, and the simplest physical object management that you can see is probably in a library systems. When people take out books and they take it back in the same way, you can take out files, you can take out CDs, you can take out anything. You can change the possession. You have to adhere to the policies and standards that have been reflected within the system. If you do not act accordingly, they will notify appropriate people on what you need to do. And the whole thing. Obviously, there's also a mixed object management, and when I say mixed, I mean electronic and physical object management. So this is when the electronic objects or electronic records relate to physical records. So there's a direct relationship that is either a loosely coupled relationship, what we like to call the weak link, or a strong link between the two objects, that the electronic object would then exist within electronic system, as well as the electronic representation of a physical object together with all the rules and transactions around it will exist within the system together with a defined link between them.
And there are obviously advantages to that. I mean, the drawbacks of a physical system are that you've got limited access, limited retrieval capability. Somebody's got to go into a physical room or storage or file system somewhere and retrieve the document, and only one person can work with that at a time. So obviously, if you've got a combination of the two, then a lot of those limitations fall away.
That's correct. I mean, the good example, in fact, you can try and do it, try and limit it as much as possible. The good example of me implementing a records management solution for Department of Transport would be that they wanted a particular module that, as an add-on that I developed, that allowed them to scan in the barcodes that the physical objects have carried. And also there were barcodes as well that designated certain functions, such as it's been checked out, or it's been returned, or it's starting a particular process. So the barcodes would then be scanned in as the object leaves the physical room. So, there would be a process around, you're not allowed to take it out unless it goes via the barcode. So in these ways you can not just leave it to the goodwill of the people to manage it, but you can try and implement as many processes as possible supported by the technology to condition people into properly using physical object management and mixed object management in this particular case.
So a good records management tool or solution would cater for both. It will cover for electronic and for physical records management, and the combination of the two as well.
Exactly. The governance is the key, and it's the key in the whole implementation and conceptualization of records management solutions. You need to have appropriate governance that exists within your organization. And in order to get proper adoption of that governance is to create appropriate culture within that organization. And we can touch on the culture as well later on. And as such, governance needs to enforce both rules and policies within the physical world as well as within the electronic world. They have to work side by side and need to be considered by the both.
Let's talk about the culture now, because I'm guessing part of it's sort of re-education of the people, but there's an element also of the role, an actual permanent or semi-permanent role in an organization. Do you want to touch on that and
yes,
go into it a bit?
The problem with the culture is the fact that some organizations have very well-defined roles, like you said. When it comes to proper records management and proper procedures within records management, even if you have to match those, or the previous roles to the current roles, and that helps enormously. I mean, you will see, and sometimes it's not only they have only certain roles that are properly defined, whereas some roles are not defined at all. And one thing that I wanted to mention earlier is what is really important about records management is to have a proper taxonomy developed for your organization, and that obviously reflects in the electronic taxonomy of all the files, whether they be electronic or physical. Okay, that usually also exists in your organization as reflects within your organogram of your organization, for example, or so on and so forth. And you'll see, for example, companies being more stronger or more defined when it comes to creating taxonomies. But when it comes to creating and maintaining policies and rules about managing what is within those taxonomies, they're very weak. Or vice versa. They're very weak on this side and they're very strong on the other side. So you will have a company that has an enormous taxonomy team, which is refreshing and awesome to see. However, they care little about what are the rules that are governing behind the structure that the taxonomy team is continuously creating and updating for the use of the whole organization. In this case, it's a 65,000 user organization like Old Mutual, for example. On the other hand, you have obviously organizations that have used records management principles for decades and for years and centuries, and that's your government and legals and things that I've mentioned earlier. But and they have no problem with it. But they already have a culture that is already well defined, and as opposed to the other organizations, these guys need to create a culture within it. And what comes with that? What comes with that is usually a resistance, especially when it comes to electronic records management, and to within organizations that are not that computer savvy. Okay, with users that should be using it that are not that computer savvy. So what they find, especially the older users within an organization, they find themselves to be threatened by younger users that are more computer savvy within that. And that aspect of change management comes into place when you need to, in some cases, in fact, some people resort to hiring a whole consultancy that helps with change management. It allows you to create, to introduce the product and solution properly within an organization so that it doesn't receive resistance from the users where they say, we can't use this. And the second thing is to enforce it. It's not enough just to give them an option. If they have an option to do it manually, they'll continue doing it manually. So those are the two aspects that sort of hang in balance, and they need to be balanced properly between the two. You can't just enforce it without creating a proper culture, and you can't create a culture and have it live on without proper enforcement of the policies and regulations.
So it's important to set all of that up as well, and that involves changing the current operational day-to-day activities of the people in the organization.
No, not necessarily. I mean, it really depends on the consultants that are doing it. You're supposed to really go and reflect the much needed processes like records management against the current processes that the organization already has, and that's traditionally the job of a business analyst, that will go and reflect these processes against what the current need is. And this pretty much goes for any system that actually gets into organization, especially if it has a large footprint with the users.
So what are the elements that need to be configured and defined within the organization? Now, there's governance and policies you've stated, but what are the actual checkboxes, if you like, of what do you need to put in place in order to say we have a records management solution? Is it just turning on a tool? Is it installing SharePoint and activating Record Center? Or what are the bits and pieces that it requires?
First thing that you start off is creating an appropriate structure and classification. So, and this is what taxonomy is. Okay, taxonomy is the classification or principles of classification of objects.
And let's just clarify that this is not taxonomy for your electronic document storage, for example. This is a taxonomy unique to your records center.
Essentially, you should have one taxonomy that encompasses everything. You can have more dimensions to the same taxonomy, meaning that you can have more than one classification around certain objects. And you can create abstractions of these classifications and let you view certain other objects, within the same classification. What helps with the classification and taxonomy in the records management side of things is the file plan. And file plan is the most essential side. And when it comes to creating appropriate classification or, let's say, structure of your records within your organization.
I know on my folder structure, I have, on my hard drive, I've got folders and files, but I have a feeling that's not what you're talking about with a file plan.
That's not exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm touching on is the fact that the taxonomy should exist within an organization that has basically a structure or rather classification of everything, which is everything that the organization has and owns. So whether those be the electronic documents and electronic objects within an organization, whether those be people themselves, and all the processes within the organization. And then, as part of that, obviously, you have different things. So like a taxonomy of electronic objects will then be contained within your intranet system. And then taxonomy of all your records that pertain to that organization will then be contained in your file plan. And I talked earlier about the file plan. So a file plan is more of a way of classifying all of the documents according to where they belong to, according to basically the hierarchy of taxonomy terms that are common within that organization, that are being used within that organization, rather. Okay, so it's also commonly called series. So you will divide the organization, or the records needs within your organization and the processes that need to be recorded in your organization according to the most basic of all principles. So you will have it, I don't know, you will divide it according to legal, HR, and whatever divisions and subdivisions with the organization are going to be. And this is merely an example. And this will then go and dissect itself into divisions and subdivisions and and business units all the way until they come to the most granular side of things. And this is what is commonly called here a case file. And this case file becomes the most granular part of the file plan and of the records management, which is a file that refers to a particular case, or it can be part of anything, or it can be a person, it can be anything really, but it is the building block of the actual records management.
So your file plan would commonly then be based around business classifications. I know on your blog you've got a good walkthrough tutorial on setting up the records center in SharePoint, but your classifications there are around retention periods.
That's right. In this case, basically, there can be different abstractions, obviously, of this. And this was my blog post date before the release of the DoD pack that came with SharePoint. However, I've done similar solutions on LiveLink, OpenText LiveLink, and Meridia, and so on and so forth. Basically, with the DoD pack that has come through, you have a file plan builder that allows you to build classifications according to the business. And these are basically, in all essence, that's metadata that is either associated with that particular electronic record or a physical object, right? And you can have as much metadata information as you want. And those, every time when you say that there's common metadata between certain objects, that you can call a particular classification of that object. Okay, so you can draw up abstractions of that classification. So if you have a column, that says, this is a genre of music, which is jazz or whatever the case is, and you say, cool, I want to now, I have, abstraction of all the music according to, it's being sort of distributed around the organization. Let's say we are a publishing house. I'm using a very weird example, I know, but still. On the other hand, you say, great, but I want to abstract this according to the genre of the music as well, not just according to the way our publishing house operates, which could be according to the artists and all this sort of stuff. So then you go, okay, cool, I want to look at that, and this is the abstraction, of the same thing in a different way. More particularly in SharePoint, the actual records management revolves around the content types. So basically, you'll see in my example, also on the blog, I've created those disposal schedules were actually content types of the particular documents. So if you, as part of your taxonomy creation within your organization, you would define individual content types, whether those be for electronic or for the physical objects. And as such, those will adhere to the certain classification within the file plan once they get sent to the record center. And those content types as such will then carry rules behind them and processes that are associated once those things become records. So those can be disposal schedules, but this can also initiate certain processes and can basically create other records or start disposal archiving schedules of other records, depending on the processes that are tied behind it.
So we're seeing this is a lot of where the power of the actual SharePoint product comes into play, particularly the Moss product, where you can apply these kinds of policies. You're using out-of-box Moss features, but using them in a records management appropriate way. Things like saying this set of documents is represented by a content type, which specifically has a policy like disposal or review after X years, something along those lines.
That's right, yeah. So basically, we started with the proper creation of the policies and the governance within an organization. We come to building the taxonomy, and defining that. And then obviously building the terms around it and appropriate metadata for each of these records on how they're going to basically define themselves and reflect all the processes and information around it. And then obviously that also helps with your enterprise search strategy, which helps you, because search is your fastest way of finding things in enterprise content management platforms such as SharePoint. And those help you in fact define and appropriately configure search, which is, you know, from the weighings and promoting and demoting certain areas and certain documents to using also your best bets to find the most appropriate documents, you know, pertaining to the search terms and to the taxonomy within your organization. This is also what very much defines and search, you know, enterprise search rather, against internet search, okay, which is not an algorithm to finding the most accurate possible solution. This is a clearly defined processes within your organization that define how the particular items will be found once they've been searched upon.
And we spoke about that in a previous show where we were talking about search with Rory Hidden-Weeks. He made a very good, clear classification between internet versus enterprise or intranet type search. But yeah, this is a very practical example of where that makes a difference. You wouldn't be searching by most popular links to a document. You'd be searching by a record versus a electronic, ongoing, active electronic document.
Yeah.
So that's quite a clear classification.
I mean, you'll see that certain aspects of records management are being commonly used within all these, what are they now called, you know, Web 2.0 concepts and all that. Things like, you know, what me and you both have blogs, you know, and as part of our blogs we have the what they now call even the social tagging aspect. Basically, where you can define metadata for all of your blogs, which is your tags, and those tags will then be represented within a tagging web part, you know, of a sort that shows you that. That you can see as another abstraction of the same structure. So right now your blog items are structured according to the date on when they've been published. However, if I want to search about all the C# related posts, I can click on C# and I will have displayed all the C# structure of your C# blogs as opposed to the structure of your blogs according to the date.
That's an important distinction. I know that taxonomy is one of your other passions as well.
Yes.
Within SharePoint.
That's
and
right.
I think it's a great thing to get into, perhaps in a future show as well. But it has important bearing in here that most people in their minds think of taxonomy as an actual folder or file structure. And it's not. It's organization. It's how you structure your data. The same data can be structured in multiple taxonomies using different tools. So a tag cloud is a taxonomy. Your date ordering is a different types of taxonomy over the same data.
That's correct, yeah.
It's an important distinction to make, I think. What are the other elements within SharePoint, just tying back to what we were talking about, around the actual concept of records management outside of taxonomy? We've spoken about file plan. We've spoken also a little bit about the ideas of compliance, for example. But what are the other key things that people need to know about in a SharePoint context?
We're obviously talking about the DoD standard functionality that has come through with SharePoint.
Well, the DoD is an add-on pack. It's an optional add-on pack. So, to what extent is the DoD pack required to implement records management in SharePoint?
Oh, that's a good question. I believe that you can deploy very basic records management without a DoD pack that can give you very efficient and a very effective records management. However, DoD pack allows you to have certain ease of use when it comes to managing records, and also implementation and reflection of certain policies that you need to do as part of records management are far easier to enforce with a DoD pack rather than with a sort of vanilla installation of the record center. And in that aspect, some of the things are very important. I mean, some of the things are very important that I believe can be done even far better than they've been done so far, such as records relationships, and I've touched on that earlier on. This is a very important aspect of records management, and you know what? I can actually use it as an example of the private sector company that has been using it. So what they have This company basically deals with diamond mining, and they mine diamonds from the seabed. Basically, they go and they have these very specialized drills, these very specialized ships that go and siphon, either slurp up the diamonds from from a certain part of the soil within, under the sea, or they go and they cut them out. And I went through this very elaborate sort of orientation around how these things work and why they do what they do, and it's very, very sci-fi and very exciting. However, this is not the topic of that conversation. But the point is that they have very specialized equipment that needed continuous maintenance. On the other hand, they had a lot of other electronic documents that have basically related to it very strongly or very loosely in some ways. So in fact, what they require is what they refer to as a configuration management, and sometimes some people like to refer to that as configuration management system rather, which is also records management system, basically with physical object management, as well as electronic records management. So in this case, you would have, for example, certain parts of the engine, right, or all the parts rather of the engine that they're using for drilling exist in the workshop. So, and they exist on the ship. Basically, this is the same type of entity that exists in two different locations. The locations are quite important when it comes to physical object management, as well as the ownership and the whole thing. However, individual parts of these engines related to individual electronic documents, which were manuals for each of these parts. Okay, which is required within the workshop. It's required by the engineers as well as by the scientists that use this information to create these parts or to enhance them. As such, also all the other research material around each of these parts has been related, which was in electronic format, okay, including the CAD drawings of designing these particular parts. Okay, so now you had the processes around the same. So you had to have a physical representation of, like, okay, this thing exists in point A at the workshop B, and in the point B on a ship C, you have the same engine that relates to the same CAD drawing, that relates to the same manual, that says that this is how you can fix it. So if something goes wrong, they will initiate a function that something has gone wrong, which will then allow you to, through the relationships between these physical and electronic objects, bring up appropriate objects, whether they be physical or electronic, to them. More importantly, if that part broke and they needed to get a new part, they could immediately then, by having an electronic process associated with that physical part, initiate the electronic process through designated that a physical part is wrong or that it needs to be replaced, that will then go and order the new part from the closest particular workshop, and so on and so forth. I hope this wasn't confusing, but I'm trying to demonstrate how important was the management of the physical objects and electronic object within records management is in day-to-day business, not just when it comes to archiving and and disposing and things like that.
While you've been talking, it's been taking me a little bit of time to understand exactly how you've been tying it to records management, but I think the distinction is perhaps that originally my thinking around records management was it's a place a document goes to die to some extent.
No. This is a common misconception. It's just that, yeah. It's like I said. I mean, it's more about compliance and more about enforcing policies. And to maybe bolster up my example here is that there was a strong relationship between all of these things. So now if you were an engineer that needs to repair the part that has just come into the workshop A, right? You need associated electronic documentation as well as CAD drawings that are to it, okay? If they did not exist, okay, you wouldn't be able to do your job. If there wasn't a policy that these things need to exist in order for this thing to be operational and deployed onto a ship, which is a policy within records management governance, okay? In this way now, he can be sure that there is a manual associated with it, that there is an engineering drawing associated with it, that there is a process that is going to source through a business-to-business application another part or another required configuration, whatever the case is, from a third party in order to fix this. the actual governance and compliance ensures that this person has everything in place should something like this happen. And this goes on to beyond the normal or should I say traditional view of records management, where you just use it if you get sued. Okay. In the case of litigation, to prove that there is a record showing that this person is lying, for example, or whatever the case is. So this is an example of how the records management, in fact, helps you in your day-to-day operations of your business. This was very important to this client because for them, not to mine diamonds for a day meant loss of multiple millions of rands or dollars to that effect.
Depending on the exchange rate.
Depending on the exchange rate. However, hence such system was of paramount importance for such system to be in place and to enforce such policies.
It's a very interesting take on the idea of records management. As I say, not the end of life of the document, but the start of it really. And it boils down to what you raised at the beginning, the definition of a record. Is it's not an active living document to the extent that it gets changed and modified, but it's a document that is permanently unchanging in its current form. So you may have multiple versions of an engine as a new model is released.
Yeah.
And you would have a new manual associated with that, but it becomes a distinct record because there are still old versions of that engine.
That's
and
right.
You need the old manuals to be just as easily retrievable for those
correct.
maintenance engineers.
Yeah. And the processes around it. The process itself is a record as well. Okay, so you have to remember that. I mean, the actual transaction and the process is the record and the whole thing. That's what records management is really. Why is document a record? Because it records a transaction, of that, and that's what is important around it. So in fact, the audit logs of the workflow behind it becomes a record as well. Government, on the other hand, and the public sector keeps records mostly for litigation purposes. They actually keep it mostly for also to determine how old or whatever, how compliant certain documents are in certain cases, and you're going to find it. And this was for, let's use for example, Department of Social Services. The Department of Social Services had a requirement to automate the creation of, or rather the processing of their social grants that people apply for. As part of the social grant or application of the social grant, they need to bring in supporting documentation, which is common with just about any government process. In this case, much like in any other case, they would have to bring in their ID document. They would have to bring in case of disability grant, they would have to bring in a doctor's certificate. They would have to bring in, in some cases, birth certificate. They would have to bring in the, whole bunch of supporting documentation extra. Some of this documentation is only pertinent for a certain period of time. If you receive it and if it's reflected that it's been that a doctor's certificate has been released, on a particular date, that's when the life of that record begins. Okay, and if it's only pertinent for the next 6 months, and if the person does not bring the rest of the documentation for initiation of this of the social grant process, he needs to get this doctor's certificate reissued, because by that time it's probably not pertinent anymore, or it cannot be traceable anymore with that particular doctor. Okay, so that's the most common case when, and this is this particular installation or deployment, and which was which was a distributed solution, loosely coupled. The distributed solution, which was with intention of being also centrally controlled, was using multiple district offices, has in fact speeded up the creation and processing of these social grants, which were very essential to the poorer segment of the population, from 3 months to 2 days, and in some cases with AIDS grants to 2 hours. This project received an accolade of becoming a top IT project for Premier's Award of Excellence, and I'm lucky to basically I was a technical lead and a project lead on this project. Basically did the architecture as well as handled the implementation and the teams involved in deploying this solution.
Wow, that's a great success story. It's when you can see your work really having an effect on society.
I'm glad. The main reason for that is, and this is coming back again, was the lost file syndrome that we've talked about, and it was continuous fraud. Basically, people were applying for the social grant at not just at the office, district office where they resided, but at other offices as well. And they had no way of comparing centrally that the same application exists in multiple district offices. On the other hand, they've also applied on behalf of people that were already deceased. So an extract from the harness system from Department of Home Affairs, which wasn't a direct integration, which was more of an assessment that the system allowed for assessment of, because they didn't allow us for that integration. However, they could continuously check whether the people are deceased or not for the applications that are in there.
And that status only changes in one direction.
So yes, so that has also resulted in a lot of money being saved by the government. They've been using millions before this. Now they have They have a system that allows them to save a lot of money, which also allows for increased distribution of the same budget that the government has, which basically means that that people start receiving higher grants than usual, much faster than before, So that was pretty cool.
Well, Zlatan, thanks. You've really enlightened me quite a bit on the process and the concepts of records management. I'm hoping I can use it practically day to day. I'm sure I'll be able to to make use of those ideas. Where can people come to find you and maybe contact you and hear a little bit more about some of the ideas? Can you maybe give us your blog address and maybe also tell us where we'll hopefully be seeing you at conferences or talks in the community coming up in the future?
Yes, definitely. Basically, I regularly speak at SE Developer and Information Work community events in Cape Town. I recently started also doing live meeting events to the Joburg crowd, which is quite cool. I'm looking forward to doing more of those. The first one I did earlier last month. It was on SharePoint Tool Fest. My blog address is .net.org.za/Zlatan. I'm also going to be presenting at TechEd Africa, which is going to be in Durban. I'll probably be also presenting at SharePoint and SQL Best Practices Conference in Washington later this year. I will also be presenting at SharePoint conference in Slovenia.
Okay, great. Zlatan, thanks again for your time. If you've got any questions about any of the ideas discussed in this episode, or you'd like to give other feedback, like show topics or requests, then mail us at feedback@TheMossShow.com. To access the archives of all of our shows, browse to www.themossShow.com or www.TheMossShow.com.